From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
It's not been easy for me. It has not been easy for me. And, you know, I started off in Brooklyn. My father gave me a small loan of $1 million. I came into Manhattan, and I had to pay him back, and I had to pay him back with interest.
While President Trump has often described himself as a self-made billionaire, a major New York Times expose has revealed Trump inherited his family's wealth through tax dodges and outright fraud. We'll speak to Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times reporter David Barstow, the lead author of the expose.
What we found out is that President Trump participated in a series of legally dubious tax schemes, including instances of outright fraud that greatly increased the size of the inherited fortune he received from his parents, including such things as setting up sham corporations that were intended to basically drain cash from his father's real estate empire without paying taxes.
There are now calls for city, state, and federal probes into President Trump's tax practices. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The FBI has completed its limited supplemental investigation into sexual misconduct claims about Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, with U.S. senators set to review the FBI's summaries of interviews with witnesses today. The report will not be made public. Instead, senators from each party will take one-hour turns to review a single copy of the FBI document in a secure room in the basement of the Capitol. FBI agents did not interview Dr. Blasey Ford or Judge Kavanaugh for their investigation, nor did they interview a third Kavanaugh accuser, Julie Swetnick. Democrats have blasted the FBI's limited scope and short timetable for the investigation. They're also questioning the impartiality of FBI Director Christopher Wray, who was 2 years behind Kavanaugh at Yale as an undergraduate and at Yale Law School. And both Wray and Kavanaugh worked together on the Ken Starr investigation that led to President Clinton's impeachment trial. On Wednesday evening, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell ordered a procedural vote for Friday to end debate on Kavanaugh's nomination. A vote by the full Senate to confirm Kavanaugh as a Supreme Court justice could come as early as Saturday. Meanwhile, a handful of key Republicans have blasted President Trump for mocking Dr. Blasey Ford. This is Trump speaking at a campaign rally in Mississippi Tuesday.
36 years ago, this happened. I had one beer, right? I had one beer. Well, do you think it was? Nope, it was one beer. Oh, good. How did you get home? I don't remember. How'd you get there? I don't remember. Where is the place? I don't remember. How many years ago was it? I don't know. I don't know.
Alaska Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski called Trump's comments wholly inappropriate and, in my view, unacceptable, she said. This is Maine Republican Senator Susan Collins.
His comments were just plain wrong.
Arizona Republican Senator Jeff Flake called Trump's mockery appalling. At the White House, Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders defended Trump's comments.
The president was stating the facts, and frankly, facts that were included in Special Prosecutor Rachel Mitchell's report. He was stating facts that were given during Dr. Ford's testimony, and the Senate has to make a decision based on those facts.
Meanwhile, more than 1,200 law professors have signed an open letter to the Senate opposing Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation, arguing he lacks the judicial temperament to be a Supreme Court justice. In Yemen, the World Health Organization warns the world's worst humanitarian crisis is growing more severe, with about 10,000 new cases of cholera appearing each week. The WHO says the waterborne disease is spreading rapidly since much of Yemen's sanitation and medical infrastructure has been destroyed by a U.S.-backed Saudi-led bombing campaign. In August, UN human rights experts accused the Saudi-led coalition of committing possible war crimes, including the bombing and shelling of schools, hospitals, and markets. This comes as President Trump praised Saudi Arabia and its ruler, King Salman, but said the monarchy would quickly collapse without U.S. support. Trump was speaking Tuesday at a campaign rally in Mississippi.
We protect Saudi Arabia. Would you say they're rich? And I love the king, King Solomon, but I said, King, we're protecting you. You might not be there for 2 weeks without us. You have to pay for your military. You have to pay.
Meanwhile, the whereabouts of prominent Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi remain unknown after he visited the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey on Tuesday, seeking a document he needs to get married, and hasn't been seen since. His fiancée, who accompanied him to the consulate, waited for him outside until after midnight, returning on Wednesday morning. Khashoggi, who is a columnist for The Washington Post and lives in the United States, is a fierce critic of Saudi leadership. His loved ones believe he may have been detained by Saudi authorities. In the Gaza Strip, Israeli forces killed a Palestinian teenager Wednesday as he joined a protest near the separation barrier with Israel. Gaza health officials say the teenager died after he was struck on the head by a tear gas canister fired by an Israeli soldier. This is Palestinian medic Bashir Hussein.
A canister this size, around 12 centimeters, 15 centimeters, entered his head. He was bleeding, and we could not control it. He was bleeding so much from his brain.
Israeli soldiers have killed at least 193 Palestinians since the March 30th Great March of Return protests began in the besieged Gaza Strip. Another 18,000 Palestinians have been injured, according to health officials in Gaza. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is withdrawing the U.S. from a 1955 treaty with Iran, after the UN's highest court ordered the U.S. to lift some of the sanctions it's imposed on Iran since May. The treaty gives jurisdiction to the UN's International Court of Justice on issues between the two nations. National Security Advisor John Bolton called the ICJ, quote, politicized and ineffective, and said the Trump administration will review agreements that could be subject to binding decisions by the court. A California judge has temporarily blocked the Trump administration's move to end temporary protected status for 300,000 immigrants from Sudan, Haiti, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. U.S. District Judge Edward Chen said there was no justification for the move and raised President Trump's previous racist and xenophobic comments, saying there were, quote, serious questions as to whether a discriminatory purpose was a motivating factor, unquote. In January, Trump reportedly told lawmakers Haiti, El Salvador, and unspecified African nations were, quote, S-hole countries. And in 2017, he said that recent immigrants from Haiti, quote, all have AIDS. A new report by the Department of Homeland Security's Inspector General finds the Trump administration was woefully unprepared to enforce the president's zero-tolerance border policy with migrant children held in detention centers far longer than legally allowed. The investigation also found border agents gave inconsistent information to immigrant parents arriving in the United States, often failing to explain that they were about to be separated from their children. And the report found DHS's computer systems were unable to track separated family members, delaying and in some cases preventing officials from meeting a court order to reunite families. The finding directly contradicts this testimony by Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar to Congress last June.
There is no reason why any parent would not know where their child is located. I could, at keystrokes, I sat on the ORR portal with just basic keystrokes within seconds, could find any child in our care for any parent.
In fact, the report found there was no shared database between the Department of Homeland Security and the Health Department's Office of Refugee Resettlement, known as ORR. In Texas, immigrant rights groups say immigrant fathers and some of their children have ended their hunger strike at Karnes County Detention Center, a for-profit immigration jail under contract with ICE. The fathers had been previously separated from their children at the U.S.-Mexico border under the Trump administration's zero-tolerance crackdown. Advocates say the fathers were threatened with once again being separated from their children for striking. Demonstrators rallied over the weekend to show support for the families inside Karnes. This is one of the hunger strikers speaking by phone with the Texas Refugee and Immigrant Network during the strike.
Wow.
I have been jailed for 6 months. I can't handle it anymore. The children can't either. We thank you so much because we feel demoralized. We have been punished for too long. We heard rumors of the rally. Gio raised the volume of the music so that we could not hear you chanting.
Meanwhile, in Washington state, one immigrant detainee at the Northwest Detention Center had been on hunger strike for 43 days as of Wednesday. The Trump administration's asked the U.S. Supreme Court to block Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross from being deposed in relation to his involvement in the addition of a citizenship question to the 2020 census. Last month, it was reported Ross lied under oath about the controversial citizenship question in the census. Ross claimed the Justice Department requested the addition of the question, but surfaced emails contradict that statement, showing that he was the one who approached the DOJ about including the question after consulting with senior White House officials. The request to the Supreme Court from DOJ argued Ross's, quote, mental state could be probed if deposed. At the Vatican, Pope Francis opened a month-long international gathering of bishops Wednesday to discuss the ongoing sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church. Pope Francis condemned clericalism, which refers to the extreme deference to members of the clergy, in his remarks.
Clericalism is a perversion and is the root of many evils in the Church. We must humbly ask for forgiveness for this and, above all, create the conditions so that it is not repeated.
Meanwhile, a small group of clerical abuse survivors demonstrated near the staged official meeting, demanding their voices be heard, accusing church officials of hosting delegates who were involved in covering up the abuse. A Peruvian judge has overturned a pardon of Alberto Fujimori, ordering the former dictator to return to prison for crimes including kidnapping, bribery, and ordering massacres by death squads in the 1990s. Amnesty International hailed the decision, saying it, quote, sends a clear message that crimes against humanity cannot go unpunished. This is Gisela Ortiz Perea, whose sister was murdered by the Fujimori-backed death squad in 1992.
I'm a close relative of a victim. I saw with my own eyes these criminals. I experienced this story, this horrible death that occurred in my family, this suffering that is engraved in my memory year after year. It is awful to constantly have in my mind the face of the criminals. And the most horrible thing is that there are people who continue to call us terrorists.
In Louisiana, police arrested 3 women protesters Wednesday after one demonstrator scaled a crane at a construction site for the 163-mile Bayou Bridge pipeline, and 2 others locked themselves to its base, temporarily halting construction. The pipeline is being built by Energy Transfer Partners, the same company behind the controversial Dakota Access Pipeline. Those arrested face felony charges under a harsh new anti-protest law signed by Louisiana's governor earlier this year. In Chicago, a jury will begin deliberating the fate today of Officer Jason Van Dyke, who faces a first-degree murder charge for killing African-American teenager Laquan McDonald in October of 2014. Laquan was 17. The killing was captured on a police dashcam video released under court order, which clearly contradicted police claims about the shooting. The video shows the teenager posing no threat and walking away from the officers before Officer Van Dyke opened fire 16 times, shooting McDonald in the neck, chest, back, both arms, right leg, and head. This is Officer Van Dyke being cross-examined by prosecutor Jody Gleason Tuesday.
Did you ever make a decision to stop shooting that night?
Yes, I did.
And when was that?
Once I recognized that he hit the ground.
Well, he hit the ground and you continued to shoot, correct?
On my approach, yes.
Former Maldives President Mohammed Nasheed has announced plans to return to his island nation November 1st after over 2 years in exile. Nasheed came to power as the first democratically elected leader of the Maldives in 2008 and became recognized internationally for his leadership on climate change. His presidency ended in 2012 in what many believe was a coup d'etat orchestrated by the opposition, supported by the military. He was charged under the Maldives Anti-Terrorism Act in 2015, a charge Amnesty International described as politically motivated, before seeking exile in Britain. Last week, the Maldives voted out strongman leader Abdullah Yameen, who's been plagued by accusations of corruption, in favor of Ibrahim Mohamed Solih of the Maldivian Democratic Party, the party that Nasheed co-founded. This is President Nasheed appearing on Democracy Now! In 2016.
Get all the opposition groups in the Maldives together and to see how we may be able to get the country back on a democratic path. For that, we have been able to come out with a united opposition, where most of its shadow leaders are behind bars in jail. But we have a shadow cabinet that would push for reforms, that would also hopefully look to see how we may be able to have a transitional arrangement that would take us to free and fair elections.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. The New York State Department of Taxation and Finance has opened an investigation of President Trump for fraud and tax evasion following a major expose by the New York Times. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio has also called for a city probe, and Democratic Senator Ron Wyden has urged the IRS to investigate the president. The Times revealed Trump inherited much of his family's wealth through tax dodges and outright fraud, receiving at least $413 million in inflation-adjusted dollars, that is, from his father's real estate empire. The Times' 13,000-word investigative report found the late Fred and Mary Trump transferred more than $1 billion in wealth to their children, and much of it to Donald Trump, paying less than 5% of the $550 million in taxes they should have under inheritance tax rates. As part of a scheme to reduce taxes, Donald Trump also helped his parents undervalue real estate holdings by hundreds of millions of dollars in IRS tax returns.
The New York Times also reports Trump earned $200,000 a year in today's dollars from his father's companies beginning at the age of 3, with a salary that increased to $1 million a year after Trump graduated college and to $5 million a year when Trump was in his 40s. Over the years, Trump has repeatedly portrayed himself as a self-made billionaire whose only head start was a small loan of $1 million, he would say, from his father.
It's not been easy for me. It has not been easy for me. And, you know, I started off in Brooklyn. My father gave me a small loan of $1 million. I came into Manhattan, and I had to pay him back, and I had to pay him back with interest.
He used to say, Donald, don't go into Manhattan. That's the big leagues. We don't know anything about that. Don't do it. I said, Dad, I got to go into Manhattan. I got to build those big buildings.
I built what I built myself, and I did it by working long hours and working hard and working smart. More importantly than anything else is by using my own brain. And there was a point where I was making so much, so fast, and it was so easy that I almost got bored, and it's true.
I got a very, very small loan from my father many years ago. I built that into a massive empire, and I paid my father back that loan.
On Wednesday, President Trump attacked the New York Times. He tweeted, quote, "The failing New York Times did something I've never seen done before. They used the concept of, quote, time value of money in doing a very old, boring, and often told hit piece on me. Added up, this means that 97% of their stories on me are bad. Never recovered from bad election call," he tweeted.
The Times article was based on public records as well as tens of thousands of confidential documents, including bank statements, financial audits, accounting ledgers, cash disbursement reports, invoices, canceled checks. The documents include more than 200 tax returns of the late Fred Trump, but do include the president's don't include the president's personal tax returns, which he's refused to release. White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders responded to the article during Wednesday's press briefing.
I'm not going to sit and go through every single line of a very boring 14,000-word story. The only thing, I will say one thing the article did get right was that it showed that the president's father actually had a great deal of confidence in him. In fact, the president brought his father into a lot of deals, and they made a lot of money together, so much so that his father went on to say that everything he touched turned to gold. The president's lawyer addressed some of the specific claims and walked through how the allegations of fraud and tax evasion are 100% false and highly defamatory. There was no fraud or tax evasion by anyone. He went on much further, and I would encourage you to read every word of his statement, which completely undercuts the accusations made by the New York Times.
We're joined right now by David Barstow, the 3-time Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter for The New York Times, lead author on this new investigation revealing the original source of President Trump's wealth. David Barstow shares a byline with Suzanne Craig and Russ Buettner on The New York Times exclusive Trump engaged in suspect tax schemes as he reaped riches from his father. Welcome to Democracy Now! So you have been attacked by the White House for what you've done, the piece they call old and boring. Tell us first, I mean, this is a massive piece, which is being reissued on Sunday, is that right, by the New York Times? Yep. Many-page piece. Headline, Trump took part in suspect schemes to evade tax bills. Talk about how you found this information and what were your key findings, David?
Well, first, how we found it was kind of the old-fashioned way. It was going to courthouses, scouring public records, knocking on a lot of doors, and gradually over many months, piecing together, building this trove of documents, over 100,000 pages. By the time we were ready to publish. And I think most significantly, in terms of for people to be able to assess this story, it's important to know that this includes literally tens of thousands of pages of never before seen documentation of the actual inner workings of Fred Trump's real estate empire.
But those documents, if I could just interrupt briefly, those were confidential records, so you couldn't have gotten those from the public.
Yeah, you only
records.
get those by knocking on a lot of doors.
What doors did you knock on?
I'm not going to talk about that, but good try.
Talk about your major findings, and particularly what you say is this illegal transfer of wealth.
So I think there's two core findings. One is simply that the narrative that Donald Trump has sold to the public for many decades now, the thing that made him famous, that gave him political power, and that ultimately I think was a central focus of his presidential campaign, is this narrative that he is a self-made billionaire. And what this story really reveals is the extent to which that just simply doesn't square with the facts that are uncovered and that we show in this story. So that's sort of, I think, point number one. Point number two is not only did he receive $413 million from his father, not only did he receive another $140 million in today's dollars in loans from his father, but that amount, the amount of money, was significantly increased by a series of tax schemes that the tax experts that we consulted with in our reporting, laying this out to them, said these things go way beyond the normal tax avoidance strategies that wealthy, sophisticated people will employ in any event to lower their tax bill. This was a set of maneuvers that were actually intended to deceive the IRS about the value of things that were being given from Fred and Mary Trump to Donald Trump and his siblings. I think those are the two main points, that, you know, there's a huge amount of money flowing, not just when he was a young man, but actually throughout Donald Trump's life, especially when he was in financial difficulties, especially when he was taking on new projects, and that river of money was fed very much so by tax evasion, tax dodges.
Tax evasion and tax dodges, and we're going to find out just what those were. We're speaking to 3-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David Barstow, who's just been attacked by the White House for this massive expose in the New York Times about how Donald Trump gained his wealth. Stay with us.
Well, I suppose that old man Trump knows this time is racial hate. He drawed up in that blood pie of human hearts when he draw that color line here at his Beach Haven family project. Beach Haven ain't my home.
That's called Old Man Trump. The song was written but never recorded by Woody Guthrie, again by Ryan Harvey, Ani DeFranco, and Tom Morello. Yes, Woody Guthrie never recorded it, but it's about his landlord, Donald Trump's father, Fred Trump. In the 1950s, Trump lived in a Trump-owned, Woody Guthrie lived in a Trump-owned apartment building in Brooklyn. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
In the New York Times expose on Trump's tax practice, the reporters referenced several reporters who did groundbreaking work on Trump's finances. One of them was the late Wayne Barrett, who wrote the book Trump, the Deals, and the Downfall. He appeared on Democracy Now! In June 2016 and said Fred Trump's financial support of Donald Trump was, quote, unbelievably crucial in Donald's rise to prominence.
When he opened his first office in Manhattan, the rent was paid by his father's company out here on Avenue Z in Brooklyn. And everything that he did, whether it be the Grand Hyatt, for example, to get the financing, he got the financing from two banks that his father had used his father's relationship banker, and the father had to sign the financing agreements. I mean, they're not going to give a 30-year-old kid $35 million in 1978 to build a hotel. It has to be done with Fred's resources. And Fred Trump was a great outer borough builder and really built good housing, 20,000 units totally, all over Queens, all over Brooklyn. Some of them towers like Trump Village, many of them single-family homes that he had a great reputation as a builder. He was as politically wired as his son was. I mean, they played the political game, both of them, expertly, but Fred Trump was indispensable. I mean, even Trump Tower, which comes along later in Donald's career, could not have been done without Fred coming in and supporting the financing of it. When he opened his first casino in Atlantic City, when he bought the first properties, the leaseholds for the first properties for Trump Plaza, his casino in Atlantic City, Fred rode down in the limo with him and signed all the leasehold documents. Nobody was going to be financing this kid developer, kid casino operator. It was Fred who was the key to all of it. It's so ridiculous for him to call himself a self-made guy when Fred's was critical at the political end, too. I mean, everything that came to Donald came through political connections, and they were political connections forged by his father over decades with Brooklyn politicians. He came from the same political club as the then mayor of New York, Abe Beame, and when he had to get an option for the Grand Hyatt and for the West Side Yards from a bankrupt railroad in Philadelphia, Penn Central, and the people who were selling the assets of the bankrupt railroad wanted to make sure that the option that they gave, they were giving it to a developer who would actually develop, because that's when the real payment comes to the railroad. And so they came up from Philadelphia, and Fred Trump greets them. And Fred and Donald get them in a limo and take them down to City Hall, and there's Abe Beame standing on the steps of City Hall. Anything you want, we'll give you. So this is totally a byproduct of Fred's relationship.
So that's the great reporter Wayne Barrett, who dogged President Trump, Donald Trump, long before he was president, for decades, and of course wrote a book about him. Juan Gonzalez and I went to his house to interview him just before he died. David Barstow, you're a three-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. Wayne, of course, one of your colleagues over the decades. You cite him in your piece. He's giving us some sense of who Fred Trump was, but go back to the beginning and talk about baby Trump, that's baby Donald Trump, and how he started to accrue this wealth, something very different than he is told.
Yeah, so how does a 3-year-old end up making $200,000 a year, right? That's a good question. Here's how it worked. Fred Trump, Wayne is absolutely right that he was a really great builder in the outer boroughs. But much of his building was actually made possible through federal housing subsidies. He was actually one of the country's biggest recipients of cheap building loans, basically made possible by the federal government. And he used $26 million or so of those cheap loans to build two of his biggest apartment complexes in New York, a place called Beach Haven and another place called Shore Haven, both out in Brooklyn. These are massive, massive apartment complexes, thousands and thousands of units. And so he was building those in the late 40s. And what he did was something quite clever. He put the land underneath the buildings into a trust and made his children the beneficiaries of that trust. And then he had the companies, his companies, that were actually building the buildings on top of the land, sign 99-year leases to pay rent to the landlords, his young children. And so what that meant was that Donald Trump, starting at age 3, was Fred Trump's landlord. He was collecting rent payments from Fred Trump's companies. And it was this kind of maneuver, right, setting up these sort of mechanisms, these financial mechanisms that would just kind of create this automatic streams of money that would just sort of month by month by month would trickle into trust accounts or into partnerships and find their way ultimately into the pockets of his children. Fred Trump was just a genius at coming up with new ways, new revenue streams to funnel into the pockets of his children. So he didn't just make his children his landlord, he also made his children his banker. He made Donald Trump didn't just put him on the salary as a vice president of Fred Trump's companies, he also then paid him separately to be his consultant. He paid him separately to be a property manager. He paid him separately to be a purchasing agent, and on and on and on it went. And in the course of as we gathered up all of this, the records from inside of his Fred Trump's real estate empire, we started counting up how many different revenue streams has he created for Donald Trump through the years, and we got up to 295. That's what we counted, what we were able to document. Some of these things, they weren't in and of themselves big money. Like, for example, Fred Trump funneled the laundry revenue from his buildings to Donald. That's not a lot of money, but when you sort of start aggregating it, putting it all together, it's just this mighty, endless river of money flowing constantly into the bank accounts of Donald Trump.
I mean, one of the things that you do in your piece is you give a very strong sense of the extent to which Fred Trump seemed to have a special relationship with Donald Trump, because you explain that so much of the money accrued to Donald Trump as against his other children. So, what did you learn about why that would be the case? And also that the principal illegality, I mean, what you spoke of Beach Haven and Shore Haven, the responsibility for that is Fred Trump's. And is it actually technically illegal, what he did?
So in that transaction, there's nothing illegal about that transaction that we've uncovered. That's not the point that I'm trying to make there. That's an example, though, of one of the many different ways that Fred Trump was enriching Donald Trump, starting from a very early age and continuing on up forward. I'm sorry, the other point was...
The question about the relationship between Fred and Donald, because why did he give so much money to...
So Fred Trump had an older son, Fred Trump Jr., who initially was kind of going to be the heir apparent, right? And Fred Trump was interested in, he really wanted to pass this dynasty on to one of his children. And Fred Jr. was sort of the first kind of natural heir apparent as the oldest son. But he didn't have the passion for the business. He had other interests. He liked to fly airplanes. He loved music. Fred Trump, the father, considered Fred Trump, the son, to be a little too soft, a little too nice. And before long, it became clear that he was not going to be the heir apparent. The heir apparent was going to be Donald Trump. And Donald Trump was very aware of his father's disapproval of Fred Jr. He witnessed this. Fred Sr. could be quite cruel. And I think what we see in terms of, this is really from the interviews with people who work closely with Fred Trump, they witnessed this young man, Donald Trump, sort of watching what had happened to Fred Jr. and almost forming himself into Fred Jr.'s opposite. If Fred Jr. was soft, too nice, well, Donald was going to be a shark. He was going to be a killer. So that I think is sort of at the core of this father-son relationship, which is very much what this story is about. It is about a father-son relationship. These two men were extraordinarily close. Donald Trump said, we quote him, that he felt that he knew his father better than anybody else in the world. And they talked daily. They spent many a weekend together. They were in constant communication. Donald Trump was a constant presence when Fred Trump would have strategy sessions with his top lawyers, his top accountants, figuring out what his next moves were. Fred Trump was often this sort of silent, lurking presence at Donald Trump's big, flashy press conferences. And so it was more than just a father-son relationship. It was also a partnership.
It's interesting you talk about the amount of federal grants that he got, that Fred Trump got, and interesting that just as Donald Trump came into the business, they were sued because they're getting federal support and they're discriminating against African Americans. But I wanted to go back to read from your report, David Barstow. You write, the most overt fraud was All County Building Supply and Maintenance, a company formed by the Trump family in 1992. All County's ostensible purpose was to be the purchasing agent for Fred Trump's buildings, buying everything from boilers to cleaning supplies. It did no such thing, records and interviews show. Instead, All County siphoned millions of dollars from Fred Trump's empire by simply marking up purchases already made by his employees. Those millions, effectively untaxed gifts, then flowed to All County's owners, Donald Trump, his siblings, and a cousin. Fred Trump then used the padded All County receipts to justify bigger rent increases for thousands of tenants. Dave.
Yeah, I mean, this is something where when Donald Trump says this is old news, I can tell you that no one had ever heard of All County Building Supply and Maintenance. It's never been written about, described anywhere. And this is actually a kind of a remarkable, in a way, when we were peeling back the layers on this, it felt, sort of like one of these sort of gritty scams that you might see in The Sopranos, right? It's setting up this company to make basically huge cash gifts from Fred Trump to his children look like legitimate business transactions. Let me give you just a really simple example. This is one that we describe, and we actually show in the story the actual invoices and purchase orders, so you can all see for yourself exactly what I'm talking about. So they set up this company, All County Building Supply and Maintenance. It's not a real company. There's no corporate offices. It's actually headquartered in the basement of Fred Trump's favorite nephew. The owners of All County Building Supply, though, were Fred Trump's 4 children and his nephew. And all that happened was, so anytime Fred Trump was going to improve his buildings, he had to buy stuff, right? And in this case, as soon after they formed this company, they bought 60 boilers, 60 big, expensive boilers from a company in the Bronx. Fred Trump himself personally negotiated the purchase price of these boilers. Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of boilers. The man who sold Fred Trump these boilers, Leon Eastman, told me in an interview that one day he comes back to his office and there's an envelope and there's a check, huge check, from this company, All County Building Supply. He's like, who the heck are these guys? Never heard of them, didn't know who they were. And what that was it was All County Building Supply was paying him the price that Fred Trump had negotiated, but then All County Building Supply would turn around and would send an invoice to Fred Trump for the very same boilers, but the invoice was padded, marked up 20, 30, 50% more. So all it was doing, it was just a invoice padding operation. It was taking the things that Fred Trump was already buying, adding 20, 30, 40, 50, 100% more, and then charging Fred Trump. Fred Trump was effectively overcharging himself. That's what it looked like on paper. But in fact, all of those profits are then flowing directly to his children. That's point number one.
And he's not just a child. Donald Trump is like 46 when All County was set
Yes,
up.
absolutely. Absolutely. And this was part of a fairly well considered and orchestrated strategy that the Trump family came up with when they realized, Fred Trump he's getting up there in age. He's starting to suffer some ill effects, dementia, other problems. And they're realizing if he dies, all of this empire, all of the buildings and huge amounts of cash sitting in his accounts, those are going to be subject to a 55% tax, inheritance tax. And so the idea was, well, wait a minute, how do we pull that cash out of the empire before it gets taxed 55%? How do we shift all of those buildings into our pockets before they get taxed 55%? And in this case, I think one of the things in the all-county building supply case, and I think it helps you sort of see at least the mindset here, is not only do they come up with this ruse, basically, to disguise cash gifts as legitimate business transactions, but then they submitted those padded invoices to the state regulators who govern rent increases in New York. And they used those inflated invoices in order to justify rent increases for thousands of the tenants who lived in Fred Trump's apartments. Mostly we're talking, these are working class, middle class folks who were seeing their rents go up, $5, $10, $15 a month, in part because of these inflated invoices from all county building supply and maintenance.
And can you speak specifically about the Starrett City development in Brooklyn, which Fred Trump made an investment in the 1970s?
So Starrett City is really one of the largest federally subsidized housing developments in the country. It's massive. It's even bigger than Fred Trump's apartment complexes. And in the 70s, when they were trying to build Starrett City, they needed some extra money, so they were looking for private investors. It was basically going to be this investment that would create huge tax losses. That's why rich people wanted to get in on Starrett City. It would create huge tax losses. So Fred Trump could use his losses at Starrett City to shelter all of his profits from his empire. So he made an investment into Starrett City, but he also made an investment for his kids as well. And so Donald Trump, starting at a very early age, was getting these huge tax breaks from Starrett City. In fact, those tax breaks helped him avoid paying any federal income taxes at all in the late 1970s. And then of course, as time progresses, Starrett City is now worth a heck of a lot of money. It recently sold for nearly $1 billion. And in fact, that investment that Fred Trump made way back in the 70s is going to give Donald Trump a windfall of $16 million this year.
Before we go to break, how much money would you say Fred Trump avoided in taxes?
Hundreds of millions of dollars. Hundreds of millions of dollars
Paying
in
something
taxes.
like, I think you said $50 million instead of $500 million.
So yeah, I mean, it's pretty simple math, right? We see that he transferred well over $1 billion in wealth to his siblings. It's a 55% tax rate. So you're talking about a tax bill, an expected tax bill of around $550 million. The tax records that we obtained show that the Trump family paid $52 million in gift and estate taxes. So rather than paying a 55% tax rate, they paid about a 5% tax rate. The question then is, how did they avoid the other $500 million? What happened to that? First of all, just to be clear, Not all of that. We certainly don't say in the story, and we don't allege anywhere that every penny of that was evaded money. Some of it was just usual tax avoidance measures that all rich people use. But certainly a very significant portion of that came through tax schemes and maneuvers that the experts that we consulted with said really crossed the line.
We're going to go to break and then come back to this discussion. What was illegal? What was improper? David Barstow, 3-time Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, lead reporter on this massive 13,000-word piece investigating Donald Trump's wealth and where it came from. The title, Trump engaged in suspect tax schemes as he reaped riches from his father. This is Democracy Now! Back with David Barstow in a moment.
Is what the world is talking about. You got confusion all over the land. Mother against daughter, father against son. The whole thing is getting out of hand. Folks wouldn't have to suffer if there was more love for your brother, but these are trying times. You got the riots and the ghetto, and it's all around. A whole lot of things that's wrong.
Trying Times by Roberta Flack. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Our guest for the hour is the 3-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David Barstow. Did a massive expose in the New York Times this week that's going to be reissued on Sunday. The New York State Taxation Authority responded to the Times report on Donald Trump's tax practices with a statement that it's, quote, vigorously pursuing all appropriate avenues of investigation. Meanwhile, New York Mayor Bill de Blasio tweeted, I've directed NYC's Department of Finance to immediately investigate tax and housing violations and to work with NY State to find out if appropriate taxes were paid. The mayor told reporters he's looking to recoup any money Trump owes New York City.
There was a good old boy network that obviously Donald Trump played like a fiddle and evaded the kind of regulation and investigation and prosecution he should have received many times over. He, finagled and paid his way to being somehow able to escape the kind of scrutiny and prosecution he deserved. And honestly, if a lot of people in New York State had done their jobs, he would never have been president of the United States. It's clear to me that there are real ramifications right now to what has been disclosed, that there's either potential violations of the law or in the cases where the statute of limitations has ended, that there may be very serious civil penalties that can be applied by both the state and the city.
So that's Mayor Bill de Blasio responding to your investigation. What can New York recoup? New York City, New York State, and are there criminal charges at all here? Grounds for charges.
I think that clearly the statute of limitations is the big obstacle to any kind of criminal charges. However, we actually don't know what ended up in Donald Trump's tax returns. And so if there are things that he misreported that have their roots in some of the transactions that we're describing in this article, and those misrepresentations carried forward into future tax returns from Donald Trump, that could be potentially problematic because that could maybe take the statute of limitations off the table as an obstacle.
And then there could be a criminal prosecution?
Potentially, although, let's be real here. I mean, the IRS is a much weakened agency. I mean, it's been quite devastated by budget cuts over the years, and certainly the IRS. I'm not talking about state authorities now. I'm talking about the federal IRS has said absolutely nothing in response to this article. I think the more realistic accountability that's there is this potential for civil fraud. There's no statute of limitations for civil tax fraud, and so both this, in this case, the state tax authorities, that can be a very powerful weapon if they decide to actually use it to go back and look at these transactions.
Well, let's go to some of the mechanisms that you point to in the piece that Trump used in order to avoid paying taxes. Explain what GRATs are, G-R-A-T-S, and how they were used. In this video accompanying the New York Times expose, your co-author Suzanne Craig explains how Trump and his siblings came to own nearly all of their father Fred Trump's empire without paying estate taxes.
GRAT, a trust designed to pass wealth between generations. In 1995, Donald Trump and his siblings began to take ownership of most of their father's real estate empire while avoiding hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes. They did so by creating two grantor-retained annuity trusts, also known as GRATs, one for dad and one for mom. Taxes are paid based on the final value of the GRAT, and this gave the Trumps every incentive to lowball the value of the assets. That's exactly what they did. Take, for instance, the Fontainebleau apartments. In 1982, the Trumps valued the 164-unit complex at $15.3 million. But for the purposes of the GRAT, they said it was worth just $2.9 million. They then broke up the ownership of the apartments, giving almost half to Mary Trump, Fred Trump's wife. This allowed them to tell the IRS that Fred Trump, who had exercised iron-fisted control over every brick of his empire for 70 years, was a minority owner with no real say over his buildings.
So, David, that's your co-author, Suzanne Craig, talking about GRATs. Could you just comment on whether this instrument is what essentially gave legal cover to Trump's transactions?
Yeah, I mean, so GRATs are, a well-established and legal instrument that's used by the wealthy to pass assets onto their children in a way that allows them to avoid estate taxes. In fact, if you watch TV, you'll often see these commercials from BDO that are actually GRAT commercials. They don't say the word GRAT, but when you see this...
What is BDO?
BDO is this this consulting firm that is actually on CNBC, MSNBC, and CNN, is running commercials that are effectively commercials for GRATs, and so it's a technique that when you talk to tax lawyers, they have this, they almost get a little misty-eyed about GRATs. They said this is like magic. These things are these incredible devices that assets go in, all kinds of financial gymnastics occur inside of them, and then they sort of, assets come out and they're like free of taxes.
I wanted to go to another of your former, colleagues, and that is David K. Johnston, also a fellow Pulitzer Prize winner and now editor-in-chief at DCReport.org. He noted on MSNBC that Trump's sister, who's a federal judge, is heavily implicated in these charges of tax fraud.
Let's keep in mind, Donald's sister, Marianne Trump Berry, is a sitting judge on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. She's a senior judge. I tweeted today that I think she should immediately remove herself from the bench. We should not have a tax cheat in the White House or on the federal bench.
What do you think of this? That's David K. Johnston. David Burstyn.
So I think the important thing to say about this is that Fred Trump's estate tax return is a very important document. And there were three executors. There were three people who signed off on that estate tax return. One was Judge Barry, one was President Trump, and the third was Robert Trump, the president's younger brother. When you sign an estate tax return, you're responsible for the accuracy of that tax return. You're responsible for accurately describing the assets, and you're also responsible for describing all of the gifts that were given by the person in that estate. So what we describe in our story is that the estate tax return that the three of them signed, that the three of them vouched for, that tax return is grossly inaccurate. It used all of the same kind of techniques that we described in other parts of the story, and it did so in order to make what was left of Fred Trump's empire look like minuscule. And so I think that actually, that the fact that she put her John Hancock on that estate tax return, I think that's an area that is potentially problematic.
What most surprised you in what you found, David, as we begin to wrap up?
The thing that I think continues to surprise me about Donald Trump is that this guy who has been so much in the firmament of our culture and our media for so long, and yet there's so little that we actually know about him and his finances. You know, there's this mountain of books and interviews, and you know, it's daunting to look at. But when you kind of put all of that aside and just try to get to ground truths with this guy, it's every time we've done that, we feel like, oh my gosh, the idea, whatever the idea was that we thought we had about him, it's quite different when you pull some more layers back.
After Fred Trump's death, you write his empire's most valuable asset was an IOU from Donald Trump. And you say he betrayed his father in what he wanted with his empire.
Yeah, Fred Trump really wanted the empire to stay in the family. Donald Trump was in some financial difficulty again in 2004, and he was the one who came into a family meeting and said, it's time to sell Dad's buildings. And so they did. And the irony is the price that they got for all those buildings was actually hundreds of millions of dollars less than what the actual property was worth, according to banking records that we have uncovered.
Do you think this will somehow lead to seeing Donald Trump's tax returns, this expose and the political blowback from it?
You know, it's hard to say. It depends so much on who's actually in control of the subpoenas in Congress on the basis of what happens in the midterm elections.
But they could subpoena them.
Sure, absolutely.
And so if the Democrats came to power.
And every Democrat, I mean, you know, there's a long line of Democrats who have said this story is all the more reason to exercise that subpoena power should they win the control of the House.
And your piece is coming out again on Sunday?
It is, as a special section.
David Barstow, three-time Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter for the New York Times, lead author on the new New York Times expose, Trump engaged in suspect tax schemes as he reaped riches from his father. We will link to the many-page expose. That does it for our show. Happy birthday to Becca Staley, our director. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Noreen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Tammy Warnoff, Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton. I'm Amy Goodman with Noreen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.